You guys are mics on?
Just a quick sound check. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Welcome everyone. We're ready to start a session on the art of future state architecture. This is an approach that we're taking that is slightly different than what you might think of from a traditional post-sales VCDX design, something along those lines. My name's John Arashid. I'm VCDX #1. I'm a field principal at VMware. I also do solutions architecture work.
And I'm Sean Kelly, senior staff engineer at VMware.
Cool. Yep.
I think we're one step behind on that. Typical disclaimer, you guys have seen this multiple times before. I'll give you a second to read over it. 3 seconds. And moving on. All right, so yeah, this is each of us. John, you want to talk about yourself for just a minute?
Sure. So this is coming up on my total of about maybe 16th, 17th year working with VMware. I was here in the past, went around, did a few other startups and stuff, came back. But I've always been interested in architecture design. That's one of the reasons why I worked on the VCDX program in the early days. Now I'm on the sales side as a solutions architect. And what has been developed with what we're covering on the future state architecture is something that is done during the pre-sale stage to get a partnership. And we'll talk all about that when we get to those particular sections. I'll let you go ahead and give a...
Yeah, and as I said, I'm a senior staff engineer. I've been here for about 10 years. Before that, I was a Marine. Spent a couple of years in Naval Postgraduate School, focusing on IT and software engineering, and before that, I flew helicopters. So, kind of a non-unique path to get here, but I'm here, and that's what matters. All right, so future state architecture. What is it, right? What is it? What is different about this than other kinds of architecture? Yeah, so a minimal set of artifacts developed in collaboration with the customer that describe a customer's environment, what it should look like at a specific point in time. All right, well, what's that mean, right? Why this definition? Let's break it down, right? A minimal set of artifacts. We want to engage with the customer in a way that we can get them where they need to go as quickly as possible. And we don't want to spend a bunch of time making all kinds of documents initially, right? We want this to be agile. And so we want to understand what is really the minimum set that we need in order to get something done. And a lot of times it's just a handful of documents, and we'll get into some of those details in a minute. Next, developed in collaboration with the customer. This isn't us going away and coming up with our own idea of what an architecture might be to solve a particular problem in your environment. This is us working with you from the very beginning. So the first things that we put out often aren't polished at all. And that's okay, because we want to have our customers engaged from the very beginning and every step along the way as we put things together. And then finally, that describe customer's environment and what it should look like at a specific point in time. And this matters because a lot of times in the past we found that as we engage with customers, we would kind of give them this idea of, what could be, some nirvana future state. And it's like, well, when does that happen? When do we get there? And so this is something that's meant to be actionable. Let's understand what is going on in your environment, what problems you're trying to solve. And then once we know that and what compelling events you have, in your organization, then we can map a solution to those time frames. A lot of times it winds up being somewhere between 6 and 18 months, right? I tell people 12 months plus or minus 6, right? If it's less than 6 months, we probably don't have enough time to get it done. And if it's more than 18 months, it's probably too far out. There's exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, that's our target with this approach.
I was going to say, and in every situation, every customer environment, every project that we may work on may have different things that will drive the approaches that we take on there. But the goal is it does need to be a partnership with the customer or whoever is the owner of the project that we're working on.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I mentioned that the minimal set of documents that we need to do this, right? And so this is kind of the bare minimum here. First of all, we want to understand your goals and challenges, right? If not, then what are we doing, right? If we're not working toward what you guys care about. And so we'll drive these in a couple ways, and I'll get into that in just a minute. Bottom line, goals and challenges. Second thing, we need to understand the starting point, right? If we don't know where we're starting from, then it's kind of hard to figure out the best way to get where we want to be. The next, and then you'll see this little red piece here. We need to validate that as quickly as possible to understand exactly, well, first of all, to just really make sure that everything that we've captured so far about your environment is correct, right? Sometimes there's a little bit of gap in time between when now and when we last spoke to you, and things change. Things are changing all the time, and so we want to make sure that we don't have any bad data either in what your goals are or in how your environment stands. And then after that, we can start solution mapping and identifying which features and products combined together can map to the challenges that you guys have.
And although we work for VMware, the goal of a current state architecture as well as the future state architecture is to incorporate any of the other solutions that are in a customer environment. So if they have specific backup vendors, specific network vendors, we're about the software-defined stack, right, and the cloud and all of that. But there are all these other vendors that play in there on the software and the hardware side. And it's important not only to work with the customer, but make sure that the other partners or the vendors that are working with the customer are engaged as well.
Exactly, yeah. And after we do some solution mapping and validate that, then we can take the combination of these to identify the deltas and a new solution that becomes your future state. Why does it always take 2 clicks? I don't know. Okay, so it's worth touching on this concept. A lot of times people use architecture and design interchangeably, right? You know, they'll look at something and say, oh, that's an architecture, someone else might call it a design. And we found that this was causing problems, and so we went and kind of dug into this just a little bit more. And I think this is generally out there if you look at formal definitions, but you know, we double-clicked on it for ourselves. When we talk about architecture, we're talking about leveraging abstractions for the purpose of strategy, right? We want to keep these things high level. We want to understand the components and relationships. And this is something that should take hours or days initially. And an example is what we're talking about right now, future state architecture. This is different than design. Design is leveraging the detail that we need in order to actually implement the solution, right? So if you think of a network diagram, for example, in what we're doing, we don't need to get into things like IP addresses. But when it comes to design, you would need that. So it's lower level, includes deployment and validation steps. This is something that's going to take a lot longer to do, weeks and months. And an example of this, if you've seen our VMware validated designs, these are guides that'll walk you through the entire process from the overview down to the deployment, and it's hundreds of pages, right, all together. So that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something high level for the purpose of strategy. Okay, so why are we doing this? And I think I've kind of touched on this already a little bit. Bottom line is we want to provide impact quickly, right? And we want this to be strategic impact. We want to have a common picture with you, and this really is key. How many times have you seen someone like me stand up in front of some sort of presentation, and the presentation is a little bit fluffy, right? It's in the clouds, it talks about all these great features and capabilities, but you really don't know exactly how it's going to fit in your environment. That happens all the time. The other thing that happens is someone describes their environment to us, and sometimes we don't get it. There's gaps in our knowledge. And so the picture of your environment is in sync with the picture I have in my head of your environment, so on and so forth. So by putting out this stuff on paper, that's when we see where these knowledge gaps on both sides are and where we can reconcile them. Especially when we're talking about how our solutions are going to fit in your environment that may not just, as John said, be VMware, but is going to be composed of multiple third-party solutions, right? Some of them competitors to us, and that's perfectly fine. That's expected in most cases, actually. Okay, so what are some of the inputs into this process? Well, the first thing we do is we're going to do a little bit of homework, because we don't want to come to a meeting with you guys and start off just asking you a bunch of questions with a blank slate. So we're going to get into some of the documents and try and understand strategically, where's your company today, where is it going? Sometimes it's a public-facing company, in which case we can't get into the same documents, but almost all government organizations have some sort of plan, 2025, 2030 plan that we can get insights into what you guys care about and where you're going. The next thing we want to do is gather as much information about your environment today as we can. Now, what we're showing here is a lot of things that are from the virtualized environment, right? Number of data centers and virtual machines and things like that. Those are things we may already have some access to. There's a number of ways we can collect these things, but we do want to go beyond that. We want to understand who are your partners, what are the other solutions that are in there that are going to impact whatever problem we're trying to solve with you. And the information doesn't have to be something that we collect from one of our tools, right? We do have things like Live Optics and a handful of other tools. This is...
Let's use Live Optics and Dice.
Oh, is it Dice and Live
and
Optics?
Dice,
okay, yeah. So bottom line is we can use those, but one of the best things I got from a customer once was actually just a spreadsheet. But it wasn't just any spreadsheet. This was something that they had kept meticulously up to date, this is a global company that had thousands of hosts around the world, and it spoke to every host, what cluster it was in, how many processors it has, every detail you can think about it, how many VMs were there, everything. It was actually amazing in my mind that they could keep so much data on one spreadsheet, but then they said, hey, can we just give you this instead? And I said, sure. And that worked perfectly.
And by the way, as we go through this, we might throw some vendors in as examples. In this slide where you see the host models, we would really call out the specific technologies. I chose not to do that because this is related to some work that I've done with customers. But for example, when we look at the current state, we need to look at the hardware underneath and say, hey, is this blade that you purchased X number of years ago still supported? Or is it at end of support, even with an extended support? We've had this with different models where a customer, everything seems to be running well. It may not be running as fast as some of the newer technology, but because of the end of support, we need to identify what could be reused and what needs to be replaced. And that's what you'll see as we go through. We'll give you a couple of different vendor examples. None of these are meant to degrade, or put anyone in a negative light for why decisions were made. It's to give you some examples of how the process works.
Yeah. And it's not always the entire environment that we're going after here, right? Sometimes it's just a cluster, a handful of clusters, or whatever the particular use case applies. And then probably the last and most important things is what we've heard from you, right? So in many cases, you have an existing relationship with your VMware team. And so you've had these conversations before. They're going to leverage that. And maybe not conversations you directly had with them, but maybe another parallel team or maybe someone in leadership or whatever. We're going to take all those pieces together and we're going to, again, look at the same pieces, the goals and challenges, timelines and priorities and things like that, compelling events, environment, and so forth. Okay. And then from that, we're going to come up with a kind of an understanding of what your current state is, right? Not only all the environment pieces, which we just covered, but probably even a little more importantly, what's working and not working in the environment or in the current solution. And that kind of can take on two flavors, right? What's working? Let's say something's not working today. Well, that's obvious, right? Something's broken. You need to come up with a solution to fix it. And you probably already feel a little bit behind in doing that. But there's also situations where something's working perfectly. But you also know that there's a project or something else on the horizon that it's not going to be sufficient for. And so we need to identify those things and say, all right, what do we need to do as we look toward the future to make sure that you have everything you need in place? Okay, and then we'll take this, and this is one example of what a current state might be, just capturing a simple process. But we'll put something there, and we're gonna put it in front of you. And we put it in front of you, you might look at it and be a little bit confused because you're like, well, wait a minute. Why did he have Dell in there? We're at Cisco UCS now. We switched that out 6 months ago or whatever. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be gaps in our knowledge. And this is where us working together with you throughout is really important to, find all these mistakes, find all the gaps, and go ahead and start marking them up. And I guess that's what I'm saying is if someone like me takes the time to put together this nice architecture, a nice picture, and so a lot of times they're a lot more extensive than this, we found that customers don't want to mark it up. They put a lot of time and it looks pretty, and I'll just kind of keep quiet. They made a few mistakes. No point in mentioning it. That's not what we want. We want you to throw darts at this thing. We want you to mark it up. We want to know everything that's wrong, whether it's something that we got specifically wrong in here or whether it's something we completely missed. Right?
A lot of times it could be historical where the customer may have used specific types of vendor equipment and then over time it changed. But what was shared with us might be from somebody that's not doing the current work in the environment. And I've had this sometimes. There's a manager that's not part of the group that's focused on the, running the operations, and they have shared something with us that has changed. This is an example of, and that's where it's discovery from the customer. We've got a starting point to get things moving quickly. We start working on the stuff that we can focus on, get the answers to, make the corrections, and then we can start digging down on the actual future state architecture where we start aligning with the business as well as the technical drivers.
Yeah, and this wasn't just for demonstration purposes. It's so easy to pick on hardware and say, oh, you got the hardware wrong, cross that out. But what if the process is wrong? What if in having these conversations about your current process for provisioning machines or something much more complex, what if in taking our notes we got that wrong, we misunderstood something? That's where these conversations are really important. So the inputs, are going to be coming from these conversations that we have and us throwing things out there that may not be 100% correct. Right. And I'll let John take it over here and now speak to some of the outputs.
So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the examples are based on prior work that we've done with customers. We've changed a few things, obviously, to anonymize, so there's no issues there. But the key that I want to show you is what we're actually producing. First off, we usually will call out phases. Sometimes it could be multiple phases, and as Sean was saying, it could be 6 months to 18 months. That's a typical time frame. The example that I have here was planned out to be a 3-year cycle, each phase roughly 1 year. Start with doing a response to the customer demand of having a cloud-like environment. That's what this example is tied to. And that's a reactive stance to what the demand is from the users of the environment. And in this case, it was cloud adoption. And the first case of this was an on-prem cloud. The second phase that we looked at was adapting, looking at a proactive stance to say, look, based on your requirements and the cost models that you have and the interest of working with the cloud, let's look at multi-cloud and using cloud for elasticity on your environment, using things for DRS, HA, but also things like HCX for doing migrations based on the needs of the workloads and specific applications in the environment. And then the very last phase for this specific project was an innovative stance where the customer is looking at evolving what they had from monolithic apps to container apps, so app modernization and a digital first focus. So that's the high level. For each FSA, for each customer or each project, there may be variations on these areas, but these are the ones that reflect on what we're about to cover on the examples. So in this case, we looked at a provisioning cycle. The customer, what they currently had was a manual process. So a requester would say, hey, I need a platform, a virtual machine, to run a database, for example. And so they would enter that into ServiceNow, and then the request would generate an email to multiple people to carry out the action. Then the compute, the network, the storage teams would take that request. They do manual configurations in some cases. Maybe there's some automation there. So again, additional manual steps, what happens? We lead into longer times to actually complete what you need to do. And then the last area was looking at how they handle the provisioning and had they thought about firewalling related to where they're placing objects, how they're actually handling interactions. Those are in the details, but that whole area there, then once it's completed, can send a response back to ServiceNow to not only update any change management database, follow any guidelines on change management, but also to notify the requester that things have been completed and what the next steps might be. So in this particular case, the biggest challenge that they had was long lead times for deployment, both because of the supply chain issues that we faced over the last couple of years because of COVID, and then also they just hadn't evolved to that next step of full automation. So then what we looked at on the response, and I'm not going to go through every detail. You guys will be able to get a copy of this deck, but I wanted to focus on, for the first phase, we look at the challenges, we look at a solution, we maybe call out some products, specific products. In our case here, I have called out the VMware products, but technically we would have other products as well that might fit in if we're working with a partner and they're involved in the development of the FSA. We're not going to make assumptions that a vendor would do something a certain way. We want to make sure we've got partnership to do the right thing. And then the very last area is to make sure that we call out what is the expected outcome, and so that we know that we've delivered on what was expected at that stage. And then when we look at going to the how we actually would implement this has a very simple build out. So we looked at adding ServiceNow. There's a IT service management with ARIA automation. The idea was give the ability for users to request a t-shirt size, as this is an example. Small, medium, or large VM based on the workload. And because it's a database, they might have certain requirements based on compute, networking. For example, when you pick storage solutions, maybe it's a vSAN. Do you pick OSA versus ESA? That's one example. But as part of this process...
Let me jump in here really quick.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I get it. One thing I want to point out in this picture that I think should be true of everything you're doing with your SEs is that this doesn't look like VMware architecture, right? This should reflect the customer's environment. If customer has NetApp, then it shows NetApp. Customer is using ServiceNow, we're going to show ServiceNow. This is true for your, all your third parties, whether they're competitors or partners to us, because we want to reflect your environment. You also won't see a bunch, VMware badges on all this. Again, this is something that we're building for you, that you guys can leverage internally as you see fit.
And in this particular case, you'll see a call out of NSX, vSphere, and vSAN. So these were areas that the customer knew they wanted to adopt. And as we had further discussions, we came to realize because they want a cloud solution, and because there's an opportunity to use VCF, VMware Cloud Foundation, and potentially one of the clouds that we can offer on a hyperscaler, like VMC on AWS, GCVE, any of the other solutions, we have the ability then to say, hey, let's take that next step. And we get to that point as we go forward on adding on some of the other phases. In this particular case, this is where we started, and we looked at a VCF solution, and then the other phases build on top of that. And in this particular case, this led to shorter time, weeks or months. If we talk about the hardware, software provisioning, and then getting the full deployment, down to minutes to hours. And from the standpoint, if you have the hardware and you've got the clusters enabled, then it could be a matter of minutes. Yes, there may be change control, there may be some approval process. Some of that can be automated, where you have these types of requests can be fully automated, where you get a pre-approval for actually doing the deployment.
No,
okay, cool.
We're a few minutes behind.
So then we have another example here, exactly like the last time. Challenges, solutions, outcomes. In this case, it's focused on driving towards a digital business where we're expanding. And this is where we added on VMC on AWS for this particular customer, but it could be any of the other hyperscalers that are out there. Now, on the phase two, the other thing we want to do is call out what would this look like. Let's get some imaging around this. And in this case, we show the private cloud, we show the cloud on AWS. We've got a link that are showing with the green arrow that basically is where we would use things like HCX or other of the technologies that we have to be able to move workloads from one cloud environment to another cloud environment. Yep. On the accelerate, this particular area is where we're adding on the app modernization, where we can add Tanzu, Kubernetes, as well as some other different technologies. But here we're calling out, again, this is high level, this is a short talk. We can talk to you more about some of the details. In this particular case, we also are adding on ARIA automation to simplify the process. So the last slide is on how to get started. So we both work on the sales side. Some of you may know me as a VCDX. I lived that life for many years. I still support that program. But my focus now is on the sales side. In this case, we recommend you reach out to us. Your SE, your technical account manager can help you with this as well. There's a lot of different resources that can help you drive success. So our goal is help you overcome the challenges that you may be facing, look at your current projects and make sure we can support it and move the bar forward. And then last, if you want to reach out to us, we've got LinkedIn connections. For now, we're still on Twitter. We'll see what happens as things evolve in that environment. But we definitely want to say thank you very much to the V Brown Bag and the people that are running the Tech Talks here, and for you guys for coming on out. We'll be available afterwards away from the conference area here so that we don't interrupt anyone else. But thank you guys so much for coming on out. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.